28 young women answered ads for marriage and work in the Missouri Ozarks. 28 women who simply vanished without a trace. That's what the records show if you know where to look. But one person saw exactly what happened to them. He was 12 years old when he watched the Woods brothers lure woman after woman to their isolated cabin, saw things that should have destroyed two monsters forever. Instead, they destroyed him. For 30 years, every time he tried to tell the truth, he was threatened, dismissed, or worse. The town sheriff knew, the judge knew, the doctor knew. An entire community chose silence over justice, and the Woods brothers' secret became their secret. Then one journalist refused to look away. She found the bodies. She found the evidence. But she also found something else buried in those Missouri hills. A conspiracy so deep, so protected that speaking the truth could get you killed. How many people does it take to hide 28 murders? The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1923, delivered to Clara Whitman's cramped office at the St. Louis Tribune, with all the ceremony of yesterday's fish wrapper. Clara almost tossed it in the wastebasket alongside the usual collection of crank letters and conspiracy theories that found their way to her desk each week. Something about the careful, trembling handwriting made her pause. The return address read simply, E. McKinnon, Cedar Hollow, Missouri, in script that suggested either advanced age or profound fear. Miss Whitman, the letter began. I know you write about the missing girls and such troubles. I got something to tell about all those missing girls from back in the 1890s. The Woods brothers and their isolated cabin, where no one ever came back from. I seen things. Terrible things. Been carrying this burden 33 years come Christmas. If you want the truth about what happened in Cedar Hollow, come find me before I lose my nerve again. Clara sat down her coffee and read the letter twice more. She had built her reputation on stories that other journalists wouldn't touch. Missing persons cases that police had abandoned. Corruption that reached into the highest offices. Injustices that polite society preferred to forget. Her editor called her relentless. Her colleagues called her obsessed. She preferred to think of herself as someone who listened when victims had no other voice. Still, this felt different. The desperate quality in those carefully formed words reminded her of another letter, one she'd received 5 years earlier, about her own sister Margaret's disappearance. That case had consumed 2 years of her life and nearly destroyed her career, ending only when the trail went completely cold somewhere in the backwoods of Arkansas. She'd never found Margaret. She'd never stopped looking. 3 days later, Clara stepped off the afternoon train in Cedar Hollow, a town so small it barely warranted a dot on most maps. The October air carried the sharp bite of early winter, and the surrounding Ozark hills loomed like sleeping giants draped in autumn fire. She'd expected a sleepy farming community. What she found instead was a place that seemed to watch her with suspicious eyes. The desk clerk at the Halloween studied her with unconcealed hostility when she mentioned Ezra McKinnon's name. Don't know nobody by that name, he said flatly. And I've been here my whole life. At the general store, the same response. At the post office, identical denial. Ezra McKinnon. The postmaster shook his head with theatrical confusion. Can't say I recall anyone by that name. You sure you got the right town, miss? Clara felt the familiar prickle of recognition. She'd encountered this kind of coordinated silence before, usually when powerful people had something to hide. By evening, she'd spoken to a dozen townspeople, and not one would admit to knowing Ezra McKinnon. More disturbing still, 3 separate people told her the same story. Old Ezra had died weeks ago, maybe a month, natural causes, quiet funeral, no family to speak of. But if Ezra McKinnon was dead, who had sent the letter? Claire was finishing a solitary dinner at the Inn small restaurant when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to find a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and cold blue eyes. His expensive suit marked him as someone of importance in this rural community. Miss Whitman, I'm Judge Harrison Woods. I understand you've been asking questions about one of our recently deceased residents. His voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm afraid there's been some confusion. Ezra McKinnon passed away peacefully in his sleep. Simple country folks sometimes get their facts mixed up about timing, but I assure you he's been laid to rest. Funny thing about that, Clara replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I have a letter dated just 6 days ago. The ink's barely dry. Judge Woods' smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. As I said, confusion about timing. Rural folk aren't always precise about such matters. Perhaps someone found an old letter he'd written but never sent. In any case, I'm afraid your journey has been wasted. There's really nothing here that would interest a St. Louis newspaper. I'll be the judge of that, Clara said. No, Miss Whitman, the judge replied softly. I will be. That night, Clara lay awake in her narrow hotel bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Missouri wilderness. Something was deeply wrong in Cedar Hollow. The coordinated denial, the judge's implicit threat, the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. All of it pointed to a community with secrets to keep. But what kind of secrets required this level of protection 30 years after the fact? Around midnight, she heard a soft tapping at her window. Clara slipped from bed and peered through the thin curtains to see a figure standing in the shadows beside the inn. An elderly man, thin as a scarecrow, beckoned urgently. She recognized something familiar in his desperate posture. This was a man carrying unbearable weight, seeking someone who might finally be willing to listen. Clara dressed quickly and slipped out the back entrance. The man led her through a maze of alleys and back roads, moving with surprising agility, despite his age. They walked in silence for nearly 20 minutes before he finally spoke. You, the newspaper lady, looking for Ezra McKinnon? I am. Well, you found him, though they've been telling everyone I'm dead, which ain't far from the truth most days. His voice carried the weight of decades of fear. Name's Ezra, just like I wrote you. Been hiding in these woods longer than I care to remember. Scared of my own shadow and what might happen if I tell what I seen. They stopped in a small clearing where moonlight filtered through bare branches. Ezra McKinnon was perhaps 65, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. His hand shook as he spoke. Whether from cold or fear, Clara couldn't tell. I was just 12 years old when I seen them Woods brothers doing their terrible work. Jeremiah and Samuel Woods. They called themselves prosperous farmers looking for wives. Put advertisements in papers from here to Kansas City, promising good homes and honest work to young women willing to come west. But them girls, they never left that cabin alive. Clara felt her blood chill. How many? 28 that I seen with my own eyes. Maybe more. They had it down to a system. They did meet the girls at the train station, all politeness and promises. Take them to that isolated cabin where no soul could hear screaming. I seen things no child should see, things that still wake me in the middle of the night, 30 years later. Why didn't you tell someone? Ezra's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Tell who? Sheriff Morrison's grandfather was bought and paid for by the Woods brothers. Judge Woods, that's Harrison's great-grandfather, he knew what was happening and looked the other way. Half the town was either scared or getting paid to keep quiet. Every time I tried to speak up, I got threatened beaten once. My ma got told if I didn't learn to keep my mouth shut, something might happen to our family. Clara's mind raced. If even half of what Ezra claimed was true, this wasn't just a historical crime. It was a generational conspiracy. What happened to the Woods brothers? Burned to death in their cabin, 1894. Some say it was an accident. I know better. Some of the families, they figured out what happened to their girls, took justice into their own hands one winter night. Ezra's eyes glittered in the moonlight. But burning down that cabin didn't burn away the truth. And the truth is still buried out there, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up as they prepared to part ways. Ezra gripped Clara's arm with surprising strength. They're going to try to run you out of town, Miss Whitman. It's already started, I'd guess. But if you really want to help them, poor girls, I got something to show you. Something I've been keeping safe all these years, waiting for someone who'd believe. Clara was about to ask what he meant when a distant sound made them both freeze. Footsteps coming through the woods with purpose. Ezra's face went white with terror. They followed us, he whispered. You gotta go now. Meet me tomorrow night at the old cemetery. Midnight. Look for the tallest oak tree. I'll show you proof that'll make them wish they'd let me stay dead. He melted into the darkness like smoke, leaving Clara to find her own way back through unfamiliar woods. As she stumbled through the underbrush, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide eyes. Every rustle of leaves sounded like pursuing footsteps. When she finally reached the inn, she discovered she wasn't wrong about being followed. Sheriff Dale Morrison stood waiting by her door, his badge catching the weak light from the hallway fixture. "Miss Whitman," he said conversationally, out for a late walk. "Couldn't sleep?" Clara replied. "Fresh air helps. Funny thing about fresh air," the sheriff mused. "Sometimes it carries voices. Sometimes those voices tell stories that ought to stay buried for everyone's sake. I wouldn't know about that, Sheriff." Morrison stepped closer, and Clara caught the sharp smell of whiskey on his breath. "Let me give you some free advice, miss. Cedar Hollow is a peaceful town. Folks here don't appreciate outsiders stirring up old troubles, especially troubles that ain't none of their business to begin with. Truth is everyone's business, Sheriff. Truth." Morrison laughed harshly. "Miss Whitman's together, Miss Whitman. Sometimes that means letting sleeping dogs lie. You understand me?" Clara met his bloodshot gaze steadily. "I understand you perfectly, Sheriff." "Good. Then you'll understand why it might be best if you caught tomorrow's train back to St. Louis before you hear any more ghost stories that might give you the wrong impression about good, God-fearing people." That night, Clara lay awake planning her next moves. She'd come to Cedar Hollow following a desperate letter from a frightened old man. Now she found herself in the middle of something far more complex and dangerous than she'd imagined. 28 women dead for 30 years, an entire community conspiracy to hide their murders. And somewhere in these dark hills, evidence that could finally bring them justice. She thought about her sister Margaret, about all the women whose voices had been silenced by fear and complicity. Tomorrow night, she would meet Ezra McKinnon at the cemetery. She would see his proof, and then she would decide just how far she was willing to go to speak for the dead. Outside her window, the Missouri hills kept their secrets. But Clara Whitman had built her career on making secrets speak. Cedar Hollow was about to learn that some truths are too powerful to stay buried forever. Clara spent the morning at the Cedar Hollow County Courthouse, a cramped brick building that smelled of dust and decades of bureaucratic indifference. The records clerk, a pinched woman with suspicious eyes, initially claimed that most documents from the 1890s had been lost in a fire. But Clara had dealt with reluctant clerks before. A combination of persistence and carefully placed $20 bills eventually opened doors that had remained locked for years. The marriage records told a story the town preferred to forget. Between 1889 and 1894, dozens of young women had traveled to Cedar Hollow to marry men they'd never met, responding to carefully worded advertisements in newspapers across Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. The ads promised prosperous farmers seeking devoted wives, offering transportation costs and the security of an established homestead. What the records didn't show was what happened to these women after they arrived. Clara found herself studying a pattern that made her stomach turn. The women came from poor families, often orphans or those with no close relatives, to ask questions when letters stopped arriving. Emma Patterson from Lawrence County, 19 years old, last seen boarding a train to Cedar Hollow in March 1891. Mary Catherine O'Brien from Springfield, 21, who'd written to her sister about her upcoming marriage to a kind farmer named Jeremiah Woods before disappearing entirely. Sarah Beth Reynolds, just 18, whose final letter home mentioned how excited she was to start her new life in the Missouri hills. 28 names emerged from Clara's careful research. 28 women whose trails ended abruptly in Cedar Hollow. The county records listed them as relocated or moved to seek employment elsewhere, but Clara found no evidence that any of them had ever reached another destination. No marriage certificates beyond initial applications, no property transfers, no death certificates. They had simply vanished from the official record as completely as if they'd never existed. The breakthrough came when Clara discovered that Reverend Thomas Hartwell still lived in Cedar Hollow, though he was approaching 80 and rarely left his small house behind the Methodist church. Unlike the others she'd questioned, Hartwell didn't immediately claim ignorance when she mentioned the missing women. Instead, his weathered face creased with what looked like decades of accumulated grief. "My grandfather was the pastor here during those years," he said slowly, settling into his worn armchair with the careful movements of extreme age. "He kept detailed records of every soul in his congregation, more detailed than the county, truth be told. He believed God required an accounting of every life, no matter how humble." Hartwell's grandfather had indeed kept meticulous records preserved in leather-bound ledgers that the old pastor treated like sacred texts. The entries painted a devastating picture of families destroyed by loss and official indifference. Emma Patterson's mother came here 3 times, Hartwell read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Said her daughter had promised to write every week, but hadn't sent so much as a postcard in 6 months. Sheriff told her young women often got busy with their new lives and forgot their old obligations. The records revealed that multiple families had reported their daughters missing after responding to the Woods brothers' advertisements. They'd traveled to Cedar Hollow seeking answers, only to be dismissed by authorities who claimed the women had simply moved on to better opportunities. The Woods brothers themselves were rarely available for questioning. It's always away on business or dealing with urgent farm matters that prevented them from meeting with worried relatives. My grandfather tried to raise concerns, Hartwell continued, his hands trembling as he turned the yellowed pages. He went to Sheriff Morrison, that's Dale's great-grandfather, expressed worry about all these young women disappearing. The sheriff told him to mind his own business and stick to matters of the spirit rather than earthly concerns. Clara felt pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. What did your grandfather think was happening? Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, staring at entries made decades before his own birth. He wrote here that he believed evil had taken root in Cedar Hollow, but that the authorities were either blind to it or choosing not to see. He started keeping these extra records because he said someone needed to remember these women properly, since the law seemed determined to forget them. The ledgers contained details that made Clara's blood run cold. Descriptions of worried mothers who'd traveled hundreds of miles seeking their daughters, accounts of the Woods brothers' evasive behavior when questioned about their missing brides. Most chilling of all, notes about other townspeople who'd noticed things but been warned to keep quiet about their observations. There was a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Foster who lived near the Woods property, Hartwell read. She told my grandfather she'd heard screaming coming from their cabin on multiple occasions. But when she mentioned it to her husband, he forbade her from gossiping about their neighbors. When she persisted, Sheriff Morrison paid her a visit and explained that spreading unfounded rumors about prominent citizens could result in charges of slander. Clara realized she wasn't just documenting a historical crime. She was uncovering a systematic conspiracy that had protected murderers for over 3 decades. The Woods brothers hadn't operated in isolation. They'd been shielded by corrupt lawmen, complicit officials, and a community that prioritized social harmony over justice for vulnerable women. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Clara made her way to the old cemetery, where she was supposed to meet Ezra McKinnon at midnight. She wanted to scout the location in daylight to understand the terrain and identify possible escape routes. Her years of investigating dangerous stories had taught her that preparation often meant the difference between getting the story and becoming part of it. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking Cedar Hollow, its weathered headstones marking graves dating back to the town's founding in the 1870s. Clara found the tall oak tree. Ezra had mentioned its massive trunk scarred by decades of lightning strikes and seasonal storms. The location provided good visibility in all directions, but it also left them exposed to anyone who might be watching. As she walked among the graves, Clara noticed several markers bearing the Woods family name. Jeremiah and Samuel Woods were buried side by side under matching granite headstones that proclaimed them beloved sons and faithful servants of the Lord. The dates of death matched what Ezra had told her. Both men had died in 1894, the year their cabin burned, but their graves suggested they'd been buried with full honors, their crimes apparently dying with them. Clara was studying the Woods brothers' headstones when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find a woman approaching through the gathering dusk. Someone roughly her own age, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hidden sorrows. Miss Whitman. The woman's voice was soft, cultured with the accent of someone educated beyond her circumstances. I'm Sarah Morrison, Sheriff Morrison's wife. I was hoping we might speak privately. Clara tensed, wondering if this was another attempt at intimidation disguised as friendly conversation. But Sarah's demeanor suggested something different, a desperate need to unburden herself rather than deliver threats. I know what you're investigating, Sarah continued, glancing nervously toward town, as if afraid they might be overheard. I know about the missing women, about what really happened in those hills 30 years ago, and I know my family has spent generations helping to cover it up. The admission hung between them like a physical thing. Clara waited, recognizing the moment when a source either committed fully to truth-telling or retreated into protective silence. My husband doesn't know I'm here, Sarah said. He thinks the past should stay buried, that digging up old troubles will only hurt innocent people. But I've lived my entire adult life knowing what we've helped hide, and it's eating me alive from the inside. Sarah Morrison's story emerged in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror, reflecting decades of complicity and guilt. Her husband's family had served as sheriff for 3 generations, each passing down not just the badge, but the terrible knowledge of what they'd helped conceal. The current Sheriff Morrison had inherited more than law enforcement duties. He'd inherited the responsibility of maintaining a conspiracy that protected his family's reputation and the town's dark secrets. Dale's great-grandfather was bought and paid for by the Woods brothers, Sarah whispered. He took money to look the other way, to discourage investigations, to make sure those women's families never got real answers. When he passed the job to his son, he passed along the burden of keeping those secrets. And when Dale's father passed it to him, he made sure Dale understood that our family's survival depended on never letting the truth come out. Clara felt a mixture of excitement and horror. Sarah Morrison represented something she rarely encountered, a member of the conspiracy willing to break ranks. But she also represented the human cost of systemic corruption, a woman destroyed by carrying secrets that weren't originally hers to bear. "There's something else you need to know," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely audible, "about where the bodies are buried, about evidence that still exists, about why everyone in this town is so terrified of the truth finally coming out." Before she could continue, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the evening air. Sarah's face went white with terror as headlights swept across the cemetery. "I have to go," she said urgently. "But meet me tomorrow at my house, when Dale is on patrol, 2 o'clock. I will tell you everything I know. And I'll give you something that will blow this whole thing wide open." She disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Clara alone among the graves with more questions than answers. As the vehicle's engine grew louder, Clara realized she was about to discover whether her midnight meeting with Ezra McKinnon would provide the proof she needed, or whether the forces protecting Cedar Hollow's secrets were prepared to silence anyone who came too close to the truth. The headlights swept closer, and Clara pressed herself behind the massive oak tree, her heart pounding as she prepared to learn just how far the conspiracy was willing to go to protect itself. The vehicle that had sent Sarah Morrison fleeing turned out to be a late traveler, taking the back road around the cemetery. But Clara's nerves remained on edge as midnight approached. She positioned herself behind the oak tree's massive trunk, every shadow potentially concealing either Ezra McKinnon or someone far more dangerous. When the old man finally materialized from the darkness, he moved with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent 30 years avoiding detection. "Thought they might have scared you off," Ezra whispered, his breath visible in the cold October air. "Seen Morrison's patrol cars circling this area twice tonight. They know something's stirring. They just don't know what yet." Without another word, he led Clara away from the cemetery and into the deep woods that surrounded Cedar Hollow. They walked for nearly an hour through terrain so rough and unfamiliar that Clara quickly lost all sense of direction. Ezra navigated the darkness with absolute confidence, following paths that existed more in memory than reality, occasionally stopping to listen for sounds of pursuit that never came. "Where are we going?" Clara finally asked, when they paused beside a creek that gurgled invisibly through the blackness. "Place I've been keeping safe for 33 years, Ezra replied. "Cave system back in these hills that most folks don't know exists. Been my sanctuary when the nightmares got too bad, and I needed somewhere to remember them poor girls. Purporic." The cave entrance was so well concealed that Clara would have walked past it without noticing. Ezra produced a kerosene lantern from somewhere in the darkness and lit it with steady hands that showed none of their earlier trembling. As warm light pushed back the shadows, Clara found herself standing in a natural cathedral carved from limestone, its walls weeping moisture that had taken centuries to create fantastic formations of stone. But it wasn't the cave's natural beauty that made Clara gasp. It was what Ezra had preserved there. Along the walls, carefully arranged on stone ledges and wooden shelves, were dozens of personal belongings that told the story of 28 vanished lives. A silver locket containing a daguerreotype of an elderly couple, a wedding dress yellowed with age, but still bearing traces of hope and dreams. Letters tied with ribbon, their pages filled with promises of love and new beginnings that would never be fulfilled. A pair of delicate shoes that would never dance again. Each item was labeled in Ezra's careful handwriting with a name and date, creating a shrine to women the world had been encouraged to forget. I've been collecting these for 30 years, Ezra said, his voice echoing strangely in the caves. Acoustics. Every time I found something the Woods brothers missed, something that told the story of who these women really were, I brought it here. Seemed like somebody ought to remember them as people, not just as names on a list. Clara moved through the collection with growing horror and admiration. This wasn't just evidence. It was a testament to human dignity, preserved by a man the world had dismissed as crazy. Each carefully preserved item spoke of individual tragedy, of lives cut short and families destroyed by institutional indifference. "How did you get all this?" Clara asked, touching a music box that played a few haunting notes when she lifted its lid. "Took me years to work up the courage to search that burned cabin site," Ezra admitted. "But I knew things were still there, buried under all that ash and collapsed timber. The Woods brothers, they kept trophies, things they took from the girls to remember them by. When that cabin burned, not everything got destroyed." The true magnitude of Ezra's discovery became clear when he led Clara deeper into the cave system. In a smaller chamber, protected from moisture by careful arrangement of oilcloth and wooden boxes, he'd preserved the most damning evidence of all: Samuel Wood's personal journal. "Found this in a metal box buried under what used to be their floor," Ezra explained, handling the leather-bound book with the reverence due a sacred text.
Oh.
Samuel Woods wrote down everything: names, dates, methods. Read like he was proud of what they'd done, like he wanted to make sure history knew how clever they'd been. Clara opened the journal with trembling hands, her lantern light revealing page after page of methodical horror written in a neat, educated hand. Samuel Woods had documented each murder with the detached precision of a bookkeeper recording business transactions. The dates matched perfectly with the disappearances Clara had tracked through county records. The descriptions were clinical, emotionless, and absolutely damning. Emma Patterson arrived on the 315 train as scheduled. Clara read aloud, her voice barely steady, younger and more attractive than her photograph suggested. "Jeremiah handled the initial approach while I prepared the cabin. Process concluded by evening. Personal effects disposed of in the usual manner, with the exception of her locket, which Jeremiah claimed for his collection." Page after page revealed the same pattern. The Woods brothers had turned murder into a business, luring desperate women to their isolated cabin with promises they never intended to keep. They'd perfected their system over 5 years, becoming increasingly confident in their ability to kill without consequences. But the journal revealed something even more disturbing than the murders themselves: the extent of the community conspiracy that protected them. Samuel Woods had carefully documented every bribe paid, every official bought, every witness silenced. Sheriff Morrison's great-grandfather had received regular payments in exchange for redirecting investigations. County Clerk Henderson had altered official records to make the women's disappearances appear voluntary. Even the local doctor had been paid to avoid asking questions about suspicious activities in the hills. It wasn't just corruption, Clara realized as she read deeper into the journal. It was a complete system designed to make these women disappear without a trace. Ezra nodded grimly. "That's what I've been trying to tell folks for 30 years. We weren't just two crazy brothers killing women. It was a whole town that decided poor women's lives were unworth protecting if it meant disturbing their comfortable arrangements." The journal's final entries, dated just weeks before the Woods brothers' death, revealed their growing confidence and expansion plans. They'd been discussing recruiting other men to their operation, creating a network of predators across the Missouri Ozarks. The cabin fire that killed them hadn't just ended their murder spree. It had prevented what might have become a regional industry built on the systematic destruction of vulnerable women. "Who set the fire?" Clara asked. "Some of the families finally figured out what happened to their girls," Ezra said. "Took them nearly 5 years, but eventually enough fathers and brothers put the pieces together. They came here one winter night in 1894 with torches and righteous anger. Burned that cabin with the Woods brothers inside it, and the authorities did nothing." Ezra's laugh was bitter. Authorities were relieved. Dead men tell no tales, and dead murderers can't implicate the officials who'd been taking their money. Sheriff Morrison's great-grandfather ruled it an accidental fire. Case closed. Everyone agreed it was a tragedy, and everyone agreed it was time to move on. Clara understood now why the current generation of Cedar Hollow's leadership was so desperate to keep the past buried. The corruption revealed in Samuel Woods' journal didn't just implicate long-dead officials. It established a pattern of institutional complicity that continued to the present day. Judge Harrison Woods and Sheriff Dale Morrison weren't just protecting their ancestors' reputations. They were protecting themselves from the implications of inherited guilt. "There's more," Ezra said quietly, leading Clara to a final chamber where he'd arranged something that took her breath away. 28 wooden crosses, each carved with a name and date, each marking the location where he'd found remains or evidence of individual victims. "Took me 15 years to map where they buried the girls, scattered them all over these hills, trying to make sure no one would ever find them all." Clara stared at the crosses, understanding that she was looking at the most complete record of the Woods brothers' crimes that had ever existed. Ezra McKinnon, dismissed by the world as a traumatized old man, had spent 3 decades creating the evidence that could finally bring justice to 28 murdered women. "Why now?" Clara asked. "Why did you finally decide to come forward?" Ezra's eyes filled with tears that he'd apparently been holding back for 30 years. "Been having dreams lately. Dreams where all them girls are standing around asking why nobody ever told their story proper. I realized I've been just as guilty as the rest of this town, keeping quiet when I had the power to speak for them that can't speak for themselves." As they prepared to leave the cave, Clara understood that she now carried more than just a story. She carried the accumulated weight of 30 years of silenced truth, in the hopes of 28 women who'd been denied justice for far too long. But she also understood that the forces aligned against her were more powerful and more deeply entrenched than she'd ever imagined. The real battle was just beginning, and Clara was about to discover that some truths carry a price that not everyone is prepared to pay. Clara returned to her hotel room that night, carrying the weight of 28 murders and 30 years of buried truth. She'd photographed key pages of Samuel Woods' journal with her small camera, documenting evidence that could destroy the carefully maintained fiction Cedar Hollow had built around itself. But as she developed the film in her improvised darkroom using the hotel bathroom-esque red filtered light, she began to understand the true scope of what she was fighting. The corruption documented in the journal didn't end with the Woods brothers' death in 1894. It had metastasized through generations, creating a system where silence was survival and complicity was currency. Judge Harrison Woods and Sheriff Dale Morrison weren't just protecting their ancestors' crimes. They were protecting an entire power structure built on the graves of forgotten women. Clara spent the early morning hours writing furiously, crafting the story that would expose Cedar Hollow's darkest secrets to the world. She wrote about Emma Patterson, who dreamed of starting fresh in Missouri and instead found only death. She wrote about Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose last letter home spoke of her excitement about meeting her future husband. She wrote about 26 other women whose names had been systematically erased from history by men who valued their own comfort over justice for the dead. When she finally collapsed into exhausted sleep near dawn, Clara dreamed of her sister Margaret standing in a field of unmarked graves with 28 other women, all of them asking the same question: why did it take so long for someone to remember us? She woke to pounding on her door that made the thin walls of the hollow and tremble. Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through her grogginess like a blade. "Switman, I need to speak with you. Official business." Clara dressed quickly, her mind racing through possible explanations for this confrontation. Had someone seen her with Ezra? Had they discovered the cave? She opened the door to find Morrison flanked by 2 deputies, his face grim with official authority. "Clara Whitman, you're under arrest for trespassing on private property and disturbing the peace," Morrison announced, producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency. "You have the right to remain silent, though. I suspect you'll want to exercise that right more carefully than you have been." "What property?" Clara demanded, even as the cold metal closed around her wrists. "What piece?" "Yeah, the old Woods property where you were seen trespassing last night." And the peace of mind of law-abiding citizens who do unappreciate having their family names dragged through mud by outsiders looking to make trouble. The arrest was clearly designed to intimidate and isolate her, but Clara recognized it as evidence of desperation rather than strength. They were running scared, making moves that revealed more about their guilt than her alleged crimes. As the deputies escorted her through Cedar Hollow's main street, she noticed curtains twitching in windows and conversations stopping as people registered what was happening. The arrest was theater as much as law enforcement, designed to send a message to anyone who might be considering cooperation with the troublesome journalist. The Cedar Hollow jail consisted of 2 cells in the basement of the courthouse, both smelling of mildew and decades of human misery. Clara found herself sharing the space with a drunk who had apparently been there since the weekend. and a young man whose crime seemed to be poverty rather than any actual lawbreaking. The isolation gave her time to think, but it also gave her captors time to apply pressure from multiple directions. Judge Harrison Woods visited her that afternoon, carrying himself with the casual authority of someone accustomed to absolute control over his domain. He dismissed the guard with a wave and settled into the rickety chair across from Clara's cell as if he were holding court in his chambers rather than visiting a prisoner. "Miss Whitman, I believe we need to have a frank conversation about your situation," Woods began, his tone suggesting reasonable discussion rather than interrogation. "You've gotten yourself involved in matters that you don't fully understand, pursuing stories that could cause tremendous harm to innocent people. Innocent people." Clara couldn't keep the incredulity from her voice. "Judge, I've seen evidence of 28 murders and a conspiracy to cover them up that reaches into the highest levels of this community's leadership. The only innocent people here are the women who were killed and the families who never learned what happened to them." Wood's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "You've seen the fantasies of a disturbed old man who's been telling tall tales for decades. Ezra McKinnon is not a reliable witness, Miss Whitman. He spent 30 years creating elaborate stories to explain childhood trauma that probably never happened the way he remembers it. I've seen physical evidence, judge, documentation, personal effects, things that prove you've seen items that could have come from anywhere, Miss Whitman. Old clothes and trinkets that prove nothing, except that Ezra McKinnon has been collecting junk in those caves for years." Woods leaned forward, his voice dropping to conversational tones that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "What you haven't seen is any actual proof of crimes. What you haven't found is any bodies. What you haven't established is any connection between missing persons reports from multi-years ago and actual criminal activity." Clara realized that Woods was probing, trying to determine exactly what evidence she'd uncovered and how damaging it might be to his family's reputation. His casual dismissal of Ezra's testimony suggested confidence, but his presence in the jail suggested concern about what she might do with whatever she'd learned. "The truth has a way of coming out, Judge," Clara said carefully, "especially when it's been buried for so long. Truth is a flexible concept, Miss Whitman. What matters is what can be proven in a court of law and what serves the greater good of the community." Wood stood, smoothing his expensive suit with the gesture of a man preparing to deliver a verdict. "I'm prepared to be generous. The trespassing charges can be dropped. You can return to St. Louis with an interesting story about rural folklore and the power of local legends. Everyone benefits. And if I refuse," Woods' smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Then you'll discover that small-town justice can be very different from big city expectations, disturbing the peace, interfering with official investigations, harassment of local citizens. The charges can multiply quickly when a community decides someone is a threat to public safety." That evening, as Clara sat in her cell, contemplating the judge's implicit threats, she received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Morrison appeared in the basement corridor, moving with the careful stealth of someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The guard was conspicuously absent, and Sarah's face showed the strain of someone operating well beyond her comfort zone. "I don't have long," Sarah whispered, approaching Clara's cell with obvious fear. "Dale thinks I'm at my sister's house, but she'll cover for me if anyone asks. I had to see you to tell you something that Judge Woods and my husband didn't know. I know." Sarah's revelation came in broken fragments, words tumbling over each other in her urgency to share secrets that had been eating her alive. Her family hadn't just inherited the sheriff's badge and its corrupted responsibilities. They'd inherited something far more damning. "My husband's great-grandfather kept records," Sarah said, her voice barely audible even in the empty basement. "Not official records. Personal insurance. He called it documentation of every payment he received, every favor he did, every crime he helped cover up. He was terrified that someday the Woods brothers would try to implicate him, so he documented everything as protection. The existence of these records changed everything Clara thought she knew about the case. Official corruption was one thing, but personal documentation by the corrupt officials themselves created possibilities for prosecution that had never existed before. "Where are these records now?" Clara asked. "Hidden in our house in a strong box behind the false wall in our basement. Dale doesn't even know they exist. His father never told him about them before he died. But I found them 5 years ago when we were doing renovation work. I've lived every day since then, knowing that my husband's family fortune was built on blood money knowing that women died because his ancestors chose profit over justice. Sarah's confession continued, revealing the crushing psychological weight of inherited complicity. She'd spent her marriage living with the knowledge that every comfort she enjoyed, every social advantage her family possessed, every act of respect shown to her husband's badge was purchased with the silence of 28 graves. "There's something else," Sarah said, glancing nervously toward the stairs as if expecting discovery at any moment. A map hand-drawn by Sheriff Morrison's great-grandfather, showing exactly where the Woods brothers buried their victims. "He documented everything, Miss Whitman. Names, dates, locations. He kept it all as insurance against the day someone might try to blame him for what happened." Clara felt the pieces of a devastating case falling into place. Between Ezra's physical evidence, Samuel Woods' journal, and now these hidden records kept by the corrupt sheriff, she possessed documentation that could not only prove the historical murders, but expose the generational conspiracy that had protected them. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. Sarah's answer came after a long moment of silence, her voice filled with the exhaustion of someone who'd carried unbearable weight for far too long. "Because I can't be part of this anymore. Because those women deserved better than what they got, and they deserve better than what we've given them since. Because if I don't help you now, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I had the chance to speak for the dead and chose comfort over courage instead." As Sarah prepared to leave, she pressed a folded paper through the cell bars. "That's a map to my house and instructions for finding the strongbox. When you get out of here, and you will." Documents while Sarah replaced the strongbox and sealed the false wall. "They could here get out because Dale can't hold you forever without real charges. That evidence will be waiting for you." Clara watched Sarah Morrison disappear up the basement stairs, understanding that she'd just witnessed something rare and powerful, the moment when complicity transforms into courage. But she also understood that her situation had become far more dangerous. Sarah's decision to break ranks meant the conspiracy was fracturing, which made its remaining protectors more desperate and potentially more violent. Sitting in her cell that night, Clara realized she was no longer just pursuing a historical story. She was living inside a contemporary crime, one where the stakes kept rising and the consequences of failure could be measured in more than professional disappointment. The truth about the Woods brothers was finally emerging from its 30-year grave. But Clara was beginning to understand that some truths carry prices that not everyone survives paying. Clara's release from jail came 72 hours later, not through the magnanimity of Cedar Hollow's leadership, but through the intervention of federal authorities who'd received an urgent telegram from her editor in St. Louis. The charges were quietly dropped with warnings about future behavior. But Clara understood that her brief imprisonment had been less about punishment and more about buying time for her opponents to consolidate their defenses and coordinate their response. She emerged from the courthouse basement to find Cedar Hollow transformed into a community at war with itself. Word of her investigation had spread despite official efforts at containment, and the town was dividing along lines that had remained hidden for generations. Some residents approached her with furtive offers of information, whispering about things they'd seen or suspected but never dared voice aloud. Others watched her with open hostility, their faces reflecting decades of investment in the comfortable lie that Cedar Hollow was simply another peaceful Missouri farming community. Clara's first priority was reaching Sarah Morrison's house and securing the evidence that could transform her investigation from compelling story to prosecutable case. Following Sarah's carefully drawn map, she made her way through residential streets where curtains twitched and conversations stopped as she passed. The Morrison house sat on a tree-lined street that spoke of respectability and civic prominence. Its white clapboard siding and wraparound porch projecting the image of law and order prosperity. Sarah met her at the back door with the nervous energy of someone operating well beyond familiar territory. "Dale's patrolling the county roads until evening, but we don't have much time," she said, leading Clara through a house that felt like a museum of inherited guilt. Family photographs lined the walls, showing generations of Morrison lawmen posing with the badges and authority that had been purchased with blood money. The basement strongbox was hidden exactly where Sarah had indicated, behind a false wall that had been constructed with the paranoid care of someone who understood the value of insurance. The metal container was heavy with decades of accumulated documentation, its contents preserved in oilcloth wrapping that spoke of methodical preparation by someone who understood the importance of protecting evidence from time and moisture. Sheriff Morrison's great-grandfather had indeed kept meticulous records of his corruption. But the documents Clara found exceeded even Sarah's description of their scope. The dead sheriff had documented not just his own crimes, but the entire network of complicity that had protected the Woods brothers. County clerks who'd altered records, judges who'd dismissed cases, doctors who'd avoided inconvenient autopsies, businessmen who'd provided financial backing in exchange for silence about their own questionable activities. The hand-drawn map that Sarah had mentioned was a masterpiece of criminal documentation, showing the precise locations of 28 graves scattered throughout the Ozark Hills. Each burial site was marked with a name, date, and brief notation about the victim's circumstances. Emma Patterson's grave was marked with a small cross, and the notation March 15, 1891 near the lightning-struck oak. Mary Catherine O'Brien's final resting place was identified as April 2, 1891, beneath the twin boulders overlooking Cedar Creek, but the most damning evidence was a letter written by Sheriff Morrison's great-grandfather to his son, intended to be opened only after the writer's death. The letter laid out the complete history of the Morrison family's involvement with the Woods brothers, explaining how a young sheriff's initial compromise had led to decades of deeper corruption and inherited guilt. I took their first payment thinking it was easy money for looking the other way on some minor impropriety, the letter read. By the time I understood what they were really doing, I was so deep in their pocket that exposing them would have meant destroying myself and our family. I chose our survival over justice for those women, and I've regretted it every day since. But the choice was made, and now it falls to you and your sons to carry this burden or find a way to lift it. Clara photographed every document with growing understanding of how institutional corruption perpetuates itself across generations. Each successor had inherited not just power and position, but the terrible knowledge that their prosperity was built on silenced crimes. The current generation, Judge Woods and Sheriff Morrison, weren't evil masterminds, but trapped inheritors of a system that demanded their complicity for its continued survival. As Clara worked through the evidence, Sarah sat nearby, her face reflecting the complex emotions of someone watching the foundation of her life crumble into truth. I used to wonder why Dale drank so much, she said quietly. Why he'd wake up screaming sometimes. Why he couldn't look at missing person reports without getting physically sick. I thought it was the stress of police work. Now I understand it was the weight of knowing what his badge really represented. The revelation that even Sheriff Morrison was as much victim as perpetrator of the system he served added another layer of moral complexity to Clara's understanding of the case. The real villains, the Woods brothers, and the original corrupt officials were long dead. What remained was a community trapped by inherited guilt and a conspiracy that had taken on a life of its own, demanding continued silence from people who'd never chosen to be part of it originally. Clara's breakthrough came when she discovered correspondence between the dead, sheriff and federal authorities from 1895, just months after the Woods brothers' death. The sheriff had apparently attempted to confess his role in covering up the murders, seeking some form of immunity or protection in exchange for full disclosure. The federal response was swift and unambiguous. No investigation would be pursued, no charges would be filed, and the matter was considered closed with the deaths of the primary perpetrators. They knew, Clara realized, showing Sarah the federal correspondence. The government knew about the murders and the cover-up, but they chose to let it die with the Woods brothers. Your husband's great-grandfather tried to come clean, but Washington decided it was more convenient to let sleeping dogs lie. This federal complicity in the cover-up transformed Clara's story from a regional scandal into a national indictment of systemic indifference to violence against vulnerable women. The same government that proclaimed to protect its citizens had actively chosen to ignore evidence of serial murder when pursuing justice proved inconvenient or politically complicated. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Clara and Sarah worked together to document and preserve the evidence that could finally bring truth to light. But their collaboration was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling into the Morrison driveway hours. Earlier than expected, through the basement window, they could see Sheriff Morrison's patrol car, followed by a second vehicle carrying Judge Woods and two men Clara didn't recognize. "He's back early," Sarah whispered, her face going white with terror. "Someone must have told him what we're doing." Clara quickly gathered the most crucial. Heavy footsteps on the front porch, followed by the sound of the front door opening, and men's voices discussing strategy in urgent, muted tones. "There's a backstitch," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite her obvious fear. "But once you leave here, Clara, you can't come back, and neither can I. This is our one chance to get this evidence out of Cedar Hollow before they find a way to destroy it permanently." Clara understood that Sarah Morrison was sacrificing everything. Her marriage, her social position, her place in the only community she'd ever known to help expose truths that had poisoned her life for years. As voices grew louder in the house above them, Clara realized she was witnessing something rare and powerful. The moment when complicity transforms into courage, regardless of personal cost. The confrontation that was coming would determine not just whether Clara's story saw print, but whether the 28 women buried in unmarked graves throughout the Missouri hills would finally receive the justice they'd been denied for over 30 years. As footsteps began descending the basement stairs, Clara prepared to discover whether truth really could triumph over a conspiracy that had protected itself through 3 generations of silence and fear. The final battle for the souls of Cedar Hollow was about to begin. And Clara understood that some victories require sacrifices that extend far beyond the people willing to make.